What can we learn from archaeology? Here I will clarify how ancient artifacts, sites, and landscapes can reveal valuable information about the past. I will share examples and outline the current state of knowledge about archaeology of the Mariana Islands, situated within a broader perspective that could be applied anywhere. You may have seen portrayals of how people lived in ancient times, as shown in museum exhibits and in historical narratives. If you ever wondered about the accuracy of those representations, then archaeology will be useful for you, especially if you want to develop your own ideas about how people lived in the past. Then I encourage for you to look into archaeology as a relevant source of information. Archaeology potentially can address a broad range of topics, but it works most effectively for answering basic, practical questions about the past, such as, where did people live? What tools did they use? What foods did they eat? And what did their houses look like? So far, archaeology has clarified these issues in the Mariana Islands, as has been the case in most regions of the world. After building this basic knowledge, then archaeology can work toward addressing other questions, such as, what happened when people in a specific place and time faced a change in their climate and sea level? What happened when they encountered a dramatic increase or decrease in their population size or density? And what happened when they experienced any kind of change in their way of life? Currently, archaeology has addressed some of these issues with variable degrees of detail, not only in the Mariana Islands, but also at a worldwide scale. If you are interested to know how people lived in the past or how the world changed through time, then archaeology could offer a productive way for you to learn exactly this information. If you are interested to learn lessons from the past in order to replicate prior success stories, or to avoid repeating the same mistakes and tragedies of the past, then archaeology greatly can extend your perspective and broaden your scope of knowledge. Archaeology achieves its goals by working with tangible objects obtained directly from the past in measured places and time periods. Archaeology fundamentally involves the search for facts about what people did in the past. These facts come to us in the forms of artifacts and other physical evidence, surviving ever since hundreds of years ago or maybe thousands of years ago. The material remnants could be any physical evidence that people created in the past, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Examples could include artifacts, food middens, architectural ruins, rock art, microscopic residues, impacts in the surrounding ecosystems, and more. All of these forms of evidence have been documented in the ancient sites and layers of the Mariana Islands throughout a continuous chronological sequence of thousands of years. The body of evidence in archaeology comes from the actions of real people who lived in the past. The individual people no longer are with us today to tell us about their thoughts and about their lifestyles of long ago. Nonetheless, their actions in the past generated physical traces, and then some but not all of those traces have survived through time in the archaeological record. The objective evidence of archaeology is absolutely 100% real and therefore accurate, but it represents only a small portion of the original ancient context. The surviving evidence includes only the most durable pieces or portions of the tools that people used, the foods that they ate, or the houses where they lived. For instance, a piece of a stone or shell tool originally may have been connected with a wooden handle, but the wood, twine, and other perishable components have decomposed long ago. Likewise, a broken piece of pottery once had been part of a complete bowl or other vessel, and it probably contained food or liquid that no longer is traceable except maybe in the faintest amounts of residues. In another example, the outline or mold of an ancient wooden house post can indicate where this particular post once had stood, but the actual wood, thatch, and other perishable components of the original architecture no longer exist. The original setting of an ancient site involved diverse materials and associations of a vibrant and living context, but then the fragments of evidence gradually decayed and transformed through time. A detailed understanding of these transformations can reveal how an archaeological site today reflects a limited version of the past context. Accordingly, the surviving evidence can address some questions about the past more effectively than others. Archaeology starts with addressing rudimentary questions about technical functions and practicalities, such as where did people build their houses at 1500 BC versus the scene during the AD 1600s. This evidence then can be refined by looking into all of the other time periods toward producing a complete chronological narrative. Additionally, research may consider what these houses looked like, what people did at these houses, and what happened in the larger society and environment. If enough evidence can be found, then archaeology can investigate what made each community similar or different. Furthermore, these findings can be presented in their natural chronological order as a way to understand what has changed through time. In nearly every region of the world, the archaeological record has revealed the basic facts about how long people have been living there, as well as what they did during different time periods, in terms of the raw materials that people used for their tools, where they built their houses, and what foods they ate. The archaeological record in the Mariana Islands so far has established this baseline information about how people have lived in this remote oceanic setting since at least 1500 BC. This scope of knowledge allows any new research to proceed, based on the given factual parameters of the time depth, the ability to distinguish multiple time periods in separate layers, and the inventory of objective findings of pottery, other artifacts, food middens, and the full range of substantive material evidence within each time period. Several additional steps would be needed for addressing questions about the ancient social relationships among people, the possibility of different status groups, the political system, or the religious beliefs. These aspects of ancient life are not directly parts of the physical evidence in the archaeological record. Rather, we can create a hypothesis about what may have happened in the past, and then we can seek the relevant evidence that potentially can prove or disprove the hypothesis. In the Mariana Islands today, most of our ideas about ancient social, political, and ideological issues have been based on cultural traditions and historical texts, dated since the 1500s and mostly since the late 1600s. These traditions certainly provide valuable insights into ancient life of that time period, and several aspects can be extended much farther back in time. This knowledge provides a framework for exploring and testing different ideas about what may have happened in the more distant past. In most cases, the preserved pieces of broken pottery, food middens, and housing remnants do not directly reflect ancient social relationships, political status, or religious beliefs. Rather, another source of knowledge, such as from the cultural traditions or historical texts, can provide the idea or the hypothesis that may or may not be testable through the archaeological evidence. Most often, the surviving artifacts and ancient remnants are not relevant or sufficient to prove or disprove the historical knowledge. Instead, the cultural and historical sources provide a valid narrative of the past, independently and apart from the archaeological record. These different perspectives and lines of evidence do not always need to corroborate one another, yet they can generate valuable ideas and potential hypotheses for each other. When working with the ancient past, I should stress that both the hypothesis and the testing of the hypothesis should be clarified in terms of the location and the time period. These circumstances probably were variable from one community to another, and they almost certainly changed through time. The findings for one site or for one time period may not be representative or applicable for anything else. Now, with understanding how archaeology obtains its evidence and refines its knowledge of the past, I would like to offer an example of what has been known so far in the archaeology of the Mariana Islands. The example here can be instructive for people working in other regions of the world. As in most places, the Mariana Islands have shown numerous ancient sites directly accessible on the surface today and linked with the vibrant cultural traditions and historical knowledge. Beneath the ground, though, several layers continue deeper and into much older time periods. These surface visible sites of the traditional Lati period include the remnants of the local Lati style of stone pillars, known as haligi, and the capitals, known as tassa, that originally had supported houses, along with their broken pottery, food grinding basins, stone and shell tools, food remains, and other diverse materials from the last time when people lived at these housing sites, prior to the intensive Spanish imperial impacts of the late 1600s. The sites of the Lati period all date within a range of some centuries, including the oldest layers as early as AD 1000 and the latest on the surface continuing close to AD 1700. Beneath the Lati-related surfaces, only in some locations, the deeper and older layers extend prior to the Lati period. Several layers can be distinguished, each referring to a separate time period. The oldest layers so far have been confirmed by radiocarbon dating around 1500 BC, or perhaps slightly older. Given the surface accessibility and the extensive nature of the Lati village sites throughout the Mariana Islands, much more has been known about the Lati period of AD 1000 through 1700 than about any other time period. Moreover, considerable knowledge about the Lati period comes from the written and unwritten histories, in total portraying aspects of Lati period societies that otherwise could not have been ascertained through archaeology alone. Instead of projecting our knowledge of the Lati period farther back into the distant past of thousands of years earlier, a more productive approach in archaeology involves presenting each time period in a natural chronological order, starting with the oldest layers around 1500 BC and then moving forward in time. The older sites predating the Lati period are known in some, but not all places of the larger, southernmost islands of the Marianas. This geographic setting has influenced how people have lived in the islands through time. The Mariana Islands are situated in the northwest tropical Pacific. Geologically, these remote oceanic islands never had been connected with a larger landmass, continent, or land bridge. These islands formed entirely within a remote distance setting, where people needed to travel beyond the site of land and beyond at least 350 kilometers in order to reach any islands in the remote oceanic world. The Marianas happened to be situated far beyond this 350-kilometer range, and in fact, people crossed more than 2,000 kilometers of the ocean to live in the Marianas at 1500 BC. At that time, the first Chamorro people of the Marianas had achieved the world's longest distance of a sea-crossing migration. Ever since this event at 1500 BC, the archaeological record has been continuous at numerous sites of different islands of the Marianas. Significantly later generations of people explored and settled in the many other islands of remote Pacific Oceania, gradually expanding across the region in several incremental steps over the next thousands of years. The cross-regional archaeological evidence, the Pacific-wide language history of the Austronesian language family, and the ancient DNA findings from the Marianas and elsewhere all consistently point to an earlier and distinctive origin of the first Chamorro people of the Marianas, distinguished separately from all the other remote oceanic island groups. In particular, the archaeological record situates this ancient origin at least as early as 1500 BC, now established as the earliest of all of the remote Pacific islands. At 1500 BC, the first people in the Marianas lived at several coastal sites of the larger and southernmost of the islands. These places offered more biomass and biodiversity, as well as access to freshwater sources. Gradually through time, with continuing population growth, later generations of people lived in more and more places, not only around the coastlines, but also in the inland areas, wherever they could find suitable terrain and access to their essential resources. By the time of the Lati period, after the year AD 1000, people established formal village settlements in nearly every inhabitable zone of every island, even in the farther northern islands of the Gani. In these considerably smaller northern islands, the natural potential was limited in the biomass, biodiversity, and critical freshwater sources. For the most efficient way to illustrate the scope of archaeological evidence and how it changed through time, I will focus on one of the sites that has revealed a series of ancient layers referring to the entire chronological sequence ever since people first lived in the Mariana Islands. I personally excavated at 3 of these sites, and here I will summarize about the findings from Unai Baput at Lau Lau Bay of Saipan. On the surface, the site of Baput shows the ruins of Lati houses. These remnants are preserved at the site, now listed in the United States National Register of Historic Places. Other archaeologists have excavated here, finding deep layers that extended at least as early as 1000 BC. I excavated at Baput first in 2005 and then again at a larger scale in 2016, in cooperation with the Historic Preservation Office. Additionally, for the larger 2016 excavation, I partnered with my colleague Dr. Xiaochun Hong from the Australian National University. As part of the research at the site, I clarified how the sea level had been slightly higher prior to 1000 BC, and I documented how the surrounding landscape had changed through time. By knowing about the changing sea level, I coordinated the elevations of each layer with the original ancient landscape setting during each time period. The broad sandy beach and the coastal plain around Lau Lau Bay did not exist prior to about 1000 BC. Even the surrounding coral reef and ecosystem that we see now are more recent, post-dating about AD 100 through 200. When people first lived here at 1500 BC, they saw an entirely different setting of a narrow beach fringe close to the base of the inland slope, and they saw an entirely different coral reef ecosystem than what we can see now. The remnants of this older, ancient landscape and seashore still are detectable in the fossils of the ancient coral reefs that now have become exposed limestone formations. Additionally, the excavations at the site revealed portions of the ancient beach surface where people had built their houses on wooden posts, raised above the water directly at the edge of the tidal zone. The excavations allowed the ancient layers to present themselves in their natural chronological order. This evidence illustrated how the landscape changed through time and how people lived along with their changing landscape. Within the context of each dated layer, the archaeological findings showed the different forms and styles of pottery, the optional ways of making stone and shell tools, the diverse expressions in the shell jewelry, and the changing compositions of the shellfish and other foods in the local diet. Each category of evidence indicated significant change through time in what people were doing at the site. Accordingly, this assemblage of objective evidence can address numerous topics. For instance, the information demonstrates how people made different kinds of pottery and other artifacts through time. These findings reflect how people applied different solutions and options with their technical practicalities, as well as with their artistic expressions. Likewise, the evidence shows how people obtained different food resources through periods of changing sea level and coastal ecology. Another category of evidence pertains to the design and layout of the housing features in each layer, showing a different organization through time in the shapes of the houses in relation to the changing seashore and the positions of different hearths and rubbish pits. Based on the available evidence, we can consider what kinds of questions potentially could be addressed. Some questions could involve how people develop different ways of living with their changing seashore and surrounding environment, for example, as reflected in their food middens and in their housing formats. Other questions could involve how people created different pottery, stone and shell tools, shell jewelry, and other material objects through time, depending on how they made their choices with their practical technologies and their artistic creations. The uppermost layer was associated with the surface visible Lati ruins at the site. Baput is one of the hundreds of sites in the region where Lati ruins are accessible on the surface today. Traditional Lati were made of these stone pillars called heligi, topped with the capital stones called tasa, in turn supporting houses of wood and thatch construction. The wood and thatch parts have decayed long ago, and only the stone components still are visible. As seen at Baput, these stones of the heligi and the tasa often have fallen down to the ground. In other sites, these stones have been broken by various factors of the falling damage, growth of tree roots, and other disturbances. The Lati ruins at Baput mostly have remained intact, and they convey a sense of how they supported a house structure at one time in the past. People last used the Lati as an active housing area during the late 1600s. The associated archaeological layer, however, extends a little bit older, back to about the year 1000. Part of what makes the Lati period so interesting for people today is not the archaeology evidence alone, but rather the overlap with written history and extensive cultural knowledge. This overlap means that sites of the Lati period can be linked with the important knowledge from written and unwritten cultural histories. I hope that I have shown how archaeology can address diverse questions about the past. The answers are easiest and most confident when working directly with the physical evidence that can present itself in its own terms. The answers can be more complicated and limited when applying external interpretations and inferences. What questions about the past would you like to explore more? And how would you evaluate the possible answers?